The leaders of Ukraine and Russia both vowed to push for victory in New Year speeches, but while Volodymyr Zelensky spoke of gratitude and pain, Vladimir Putin urged duty to Russia, casting the war as a near-existential fight. Zelensky, recalling some of the most dramatic moments and victories of the war, filled his emotional 17-minute video message with footage of Russia's attacks on the country and words of pride for Ukrainians withstanding attacks, darkness, and cold. A few minutes after Zelensky's speech, released just before midnight Kyiv time on New Year's Eve, numerous blasts were heard in the capital and around the country. The attacks followed a barrage of more than 20 cruise missiles fired across Ukraine on Saturday, and many bombardments earlier. As the war drags into its 11th month, Moscow was unprepared for the staunch resistance and billions of dollars in Western weapons that have turned the tide in Ukraine's favor. Russian troops have been forced out of more than half the territory they took in the first weeks of what Putin calls a special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Kyiv and Western allies say Putin's invasion was a land grab. Putin, breaking with tradition by delivering the New Year message flanked by troops rather than the Kremlin's walls, talked sternly and combatively about 2022 as the year that clearly separated courage and heroism from betrayal and cowardice. Russia had planned a swift operation, but with the war dragging on it has been forced to put society on more of a war footing, calling up more than 300,000 reservists, retooling an economy hurt by Western sanctions and saying publicly that the conflict may be long. Reiterating that the West is supposedly intent on destroying Russia by using Kyiv, Putin vowed he will never allow that. He signaled once again that the war, albeit hard, will continue. Zelensky promised the return of lands Moscow proclaimed it had annexed in September. While listing Ukraine's successes, Zelensky referred to the Crimean Bridge, Moscow's symbol of the annexation of the peninsula that linked it with Russia and that was torn by an explosion in October. While Putin immediately blamed Kyiv for orchestrating the powerful blast, Ukraine had not previously claimed responsibility for it, or any other attacks inside Russia, since Russia's February 24 invasion. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said Saturday that his country will not forgive Russia and its aggression after Moscow conducted a barrage of strikes in the Ukrainian capital Kyiv just hours before the new year, killing at least one person and injuring several, and NBSP. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Saturday predicted victory in the war against Russia next year, saying it would come through hard work rather than miracles, as well as aid from foreign partners. Zelensky alluded to repeated Russian strikes that have smashed the power-generating system, saying light could be found in everyone, even when there was no electricity. Zelensky made the forecast in a short written message to mark the new year, a modest effort compared to the 9-minute Christmas video he released on December 24. 2022 comes to a painful end for Ukrainians. As Ukrainians prepare to celebrate the new year, fresh strikes have targeted several cities including the capital Kyiv. Explosions shook Kyiv on Saturday, December 31, as Russia carried out a second major round of missile attacks on Ukraine in 3 days. 10 loud blasts were reported to have been heard, with the capital's mayor Vitaly Klitschko saying at least one person had been killed and 8 wounded. He said air defenses in the region were engaging targets. Whilst Kyiv and other cities across Ukraine were coming under fire, video was released of Russian President Vladimir Putin raising a glass with soldiers. He was at an army headquarters in southern Russia presenting an award to General Sergei Surovikin, the head of the military operation in Ukraine. Earlier Putin had delivered a New Year's address in which he framed the conflict as a near-existential fight for the future of Russia. The West, he said, was using Ukraine and was intent on destroying Russia. For months Moscow presented the war, which it describes as a special military operation, as a limited campaign that would not affect most Russians' lives. But it was unprepared for Ukraine's staunch resistance and the billions of dollars in Western weapons that have turned the tide in Ukraine's favor. Numerous blasts were heard in Kyiv and in other places around Ukraine, and air raid sirens wailed across the country in the first couple hours after midnight on New Year's Day. Fragments from a missile destroyed by Ukrainian air defense systems damaged a car in the capital's center, but preliminarily there were no wounded or casualties, Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said. Kyiv's city military administration said that 23 Russian-launched air objects had been destroyed. The attacks came minutes after Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky's New Year message of wishes of victory for his country in the war that is in its 11th month, with no end in sight. The attacks followed a barrage of more than 20 cruise missiles fired at targets across on Ukraine on Saturday in what Ukraine's human rights ombudsman Dmytro Lubinets called terror on New Year's Eve. Kyiv city and region officials said on the Telegram messaging app that air defense systems were working. Oleksiy Kuleba, the governor of the Kyiv region, said the region was being attacked by drones. It was not immediately known whether any targets were hit. Separately, Vyacheslav Gladkov, governor of the southern Russian region of Belgorod bordering with Ukraine, said that as a result of overnight shelling of the outskirts of Shebekino town, there were damages to houses, but no casualties. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky fired off a scathing attack on Russia for a heartless wave of brutal holiday bombings, warning the terrorist state that it will never be forgiven for the outrageously cruel war it has launched against the people of Ukraine. The terrorist state will not be forgiven. And those who give orders for such strikes, and those who carry them out, will not receive a pardon. To put it mildly, Zelensky warned in an address on Saturday. He said the only true purpose of the brutal war is so that one person, Russian President Vladimir Putin, can remain in power until the end of his life. Your leader, Zelensky added, addressing Russians, wants to show that he has the troops behind him and that he is ahead. But he is just hiding. He hides behind the troops, behind missiles, behind the walls of his residences and palaces. Putin hides behind you and burns your country and your future. No one will ever forgive you for terror, he warned Russians. No one in the world will forgive you for this. Ukraine will never forgive. Ukrainians in the capital Kyiv shouted out, "Glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes," after midnight on New Year's Day, as air raid sirens wailed across the country. It was a somber rally after Kyiv endured a barrage of at least 20 cruise missiles on New Year's Eve, which killed at least one person. Later attacks around midnight apparently began minutes after a New Year's speech by President Volodymyr Zelensky. The war is now in its 11th month. In a separate message, Zelensky made note of how Russia had also attacked at Easter and Christmas. He said the war was not with NATO as Russia says, but for Russian leader Vladimir Putin to maintain power for life. Meanwhile in Moscow, Putin delivered his own New Year message on national TV, stood in front of troops. He said they were fighting for the motherland, truth and justice. Putin also repeated allegations that Kyiv and the West reject that the Western NATO alliance plan to use Ukraine as a platform to threaten Russia. Instead, the West and Kyiv say Putin launched a baseless war of aggression in a bid to seize territory and install a regime more to his liking. Ukraine and the Russian Federation conducted another exchange of prisoners of war. Ukraine brought back 140 people on Saturday, December 31st. This is another big exchange that was successfully carried out. 140 people are coming home. Among them are wounded, as well as the defenders of Mariupol, Snake Island, volunteers of Territorial Defense Forces from SUDD.ENLY, and fathers and sons who were in captivity together, as well as ours, defenders, from the Bakhmut front. 82 fighters from the Armed Forces of Ukraine, 15 from the Territorial Defense Forces, 22 from the National Guard, 11 from the Navy and 10 from the State Border Guard Service. 132 men and 8 women, 22 officers and 118 sergeants and soldiers. At the same time, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the aggressor country returned 82 Russian soldiers who were in mortal danger in captivity as a result of the exchange that took place on December 31st. Among those returned by Ukraine are the defenders of Mariupol, Zmeny Island, Territorial Defense volunteers from SUDD.ENLY, fathers and sons who were held captive together, and soldiers from the Bakhmut section of front. Wounded soldiers were also returned. Out of 140 Ukrainians, 132 men and 8 women, there were 22 officers and 118 sergeants and soldiers, including 82 soldiers of the armed forces, 15 from the Territorial Defense, 22 from the National Guard, 11 from the Naval Forces, 10 from the State Border Service. In the new year, we're not only repelling the enemy's missile attacks, but also bringing back our people, Yermak said. While they shoot, we fight back, respond and return. We will return everyone. It won't be otherwise. As of December 30th, about 3,400 Ukrainian soldiers are in captivity in the Russian Federation, and another 15,000 people are missing. According to the Coordinating Headquarters for the Treatment of Prisoners of War, 1,596 people, military and civilian, have been freed from Russian captivity since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Blasts have been heard in Kyiv and air raid sirens wailed across the country just after midnight, forcing Ukrainians to abandon New Year celebrations and head to bomb shelters. The latest apparent Russian salvo followed blasts on New Year's Eve in multiple regions of Ukraine, with 1 person killed and 20 reported injured in the capital alone. As the sirens blared in Kyiv in the early minutes of 2023, some people on their balconies shouted, "Glory to Ukraine! Glory to heroes!" City Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said that explosions had been heard and that air defense was working. He shared a picture on Telegram apparently showing where a fragment of a rocket had hit a car in the Shevchenkivsky district of Kyiv. The air raid siren sounded minutes after the end of Volodymyr Zelensky's New Year address, in which he praised those who had fought for their country since the invasion on February 24. In an address of his own, Vladimir Putin said 2022 was a year of difficult but necessary decisions and important steps towards Russia's full sovereignty and a powerful consolidation of our society. The Russian president also denounced the West, echoing previous claims about it encouraging neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Multiple blasts rocked Kyiv and other areas of Ukraine on Saturday, killing at least 1 person and wounding 14 others, in a sign that the pace of Russia attacks had picked up before New Year's. Some Ukrainians defied the danger, however, to return to the country to reunite with families for the holidays. Ukrainian officials claimed Russia was now deliberately targeting civilians, seeking to create a climate of fear to see out the year grimly and usher in a bloody 2023. The blasts also came at an unusually quickened rhythm, one that alarmed officials just 36 hours after Russia launched a barrage of missiles on Thursday to damage energy infrastructure facilities. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba highlighted the harsh civilian toll of this latest offensive, that this time, Russia's mass missile attack is deliberately targeting residential areas, not even the energy infrastructure. The deadly blast in the Ukrainian capital occurred among the multi-story residential buildings of the SUDD.ENLY district. Various residential buildings and civilian infrastructure were damaged in Kyiv on Saturday afternoon as part of massive attacks spanning the country. A top official in the president's office, Kyrylo Tymoshenko, published photos and video of a partially collapsed 6-story hotel in Kyiv. Klitschko said a Japanese journalist was among those injured in the capital. Russia launched 20 cruise missiles over Ukraine on Saturday afternoon, of which Ukrainian forces shot down 12. According to Ukrainian Military Chief General Valery Zaluzhnyi. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky published a video address shortly after Russia launched the New Year's Eve cruise missiles over Ukraine, saying that Russian President Vladimir Putin is hiding behind the military, behind missiles, behind the walls of his residences and palaces. Addressing the Russians, he added that no one in the world will forgive you for this. Ukraine will not forgive. At least 4 civilians were wounded in the Khmelnytsky province of western Ukraine, according to regional governor Serhiy Hamalyi. 6 people were wounded in the southern region of Mykolaiv. In Zaporizhia region, as a result of a missile attack, 2 houses were destroyed, and around 8 damaged. 4 people were also wounded, among them a pregnant woman and a 14-year-old girl, said regional governor Alexander Starik. Even though Russia's 10-month war rumbles on with no end in sight, for some families the new year is nevertheless a chance to reunite, however briefly, after months apart. At Kyiv's Central Railway Station on Saturday morning, Mikhailo, still in his uniform, gripped a bouquet of pink roses tightly as he waited on Platform 9 for his wife Valeria to arrive from Poland. He hadn't seen her in 6 months. Nearby, another soldier, Vasyl Komko, 42, joyously met his daughter Yana and wife Galina, who have been living in Slovakia due to the war, but returned to Kyiv to spend New Year's Eve together. Back in February, fathers, husbands, and sons had to stay behind as their wives, mothers, and daughters boarded trains with small children seeking safety outside the country. Scenes of tearful goodbyes seared television screens and front pages of newspaper across the world. But on the last day of the year marked by the brutal war, many returned to the capital to spend New Year's Eve with their loved ones, despite the ongoing Russian attacks. As Russian attacks continue to target power supplies, leaving millions without electricity, no big celebrations are expected and a curfew will be in place as the clock rings in the new year. But for most Ukrainians, being together with their families is a luxury. Valeria first sought refuge from the conflict in Spain but later moved to Poland. Asked what their New Year's Eve plans were, she answered simply, "Just to be together." On Platform 8, another young couple reunited. University student Arsenia Kolomayets, 23, has been living in Italy. Despite longing to see her boyfriend Daniel Lyashchenko in Kyiv, Kolomayets was scared of Russian missiles and drone attacks. Although they have no electricity at home, Lyashchenko said they were looking forward to welcoming 2023 together with his family and their cat. Natalia Kononenko had traveled from Finland. It was the first time she had seen her brother Sergei Kononenko since the full-scale invasion began on February 24. Sergei and other relatives traveled from Mykolaiv to Kiev to meet Natalia. France and Ukraine to agree common approach for military support, Defense Minister says. French Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu said Wednesday on his first trip to Kiev that Paris wants to work with Ukraine to find a common agenda on how France can support the war effort. Presidents Zelensky and Macron have requested proposals for a common agenda on French military support for the month of January, Lecornu said at a press conference with his Ukrainian counterpart, Alexei Reznikov. In mid-December, an international conference in support of Ukraine in Paris raised more than €1 billion in donations. A ranking by the Kiel Institute for the World Economy in December places France in 10th position for its military support to Kiev, behind the United Kingdom, Poland and Germany. The majority is provided by the United States. Ukraine has secured the release of 1,456 prisoners of war since Russia invaded on February 24, President Volodymyr Zelensky told Parliament in an annual address held behind closed doors on Wednesday. Kiev and Moscow have held a series of prisoner swaps throughout the war, which is now in its 11th month. Zelensky has said the release of prisoners of war is a priority. Russia is thought to hold thousands of Ukrainian prisoners of war, but the exact figures are not known. Following months of humiliating defeats, Russian forces are now seeking to wrest control of the eastern region of Donetsk, where Bakhmut has become the epicenter of fighting. In Bakhmut, there is no place that is not covered with blood. There is no hour when the terrible roar of artillery does not sound, Zelensky said. Earlier on Wednesday, the Ukrainian army said Moscow's forces were continuing offensive actions in the direction of Bakhmut. French Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu arrived in Kiev on Wednesday to discuss further military support for Ukraine, insisting the French government's backing is unflagging while efforts are made to reach an eventual negotiated end to Russia's invasion. In the Kharkiv region, it is only now, months of intense Russian bombardment down the line, that Ukrainian electrical engineers are beginning to reconnect the power grid amid freezing conditions. France 24's Andrew Hillier, Elena Volokhin and Abdelkader Dermaz visited a village near the front line where barely a single home was left undamaged during the fighting. Ukraine has bought some 1,400 drones, mostly for reconnaissance, and plans to develop combat models that can attack the exploding drones Russia has used during its invasion of the country, according to the Ukrainian government minister in charge of technology. President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday delivered Russia's long-awaited response to the cap, signing a decree that bans the supply of crude oil and oil products from February 1 for 5 months to nations that abide by it. Air raid sirens sounded across all of Ukraine's regions on Wednesday, officials said. One of President Vladimir Putin's most powerful Kremlin aides has visited the Russian-controlled Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in a part of southern Ukraine Russia says it has annexed, a Moscow-installed official in the region said. Sergei Kiriyenko, a Kremlin official responsible for overseeing Russia's domestic politics and a former head of the country's state nuclear corporation, discussed the safety of the plant, according to Vladimir Rogov, a Russian-installed local official. Russian forces fired 33 rockets at civilian targets in the Ukrainian city of Kherson in the 24 hours to early Wednesday, Ukraine's military said, as fighting intensified with Russia deploying more tanks and armored vehicles on front lines. There has been very little change in terms of the front line, but pressure from the enemy has intensified, both in terms of the numbers of men and the type and quantity of equipment, said Ukrainian military analyst Ola Zhdanov. Russian forces abandoned Kherson last month in one of Ukraine's most significant gains in the 11-month war, but fighting has entered a slow, grinding phase as bitter winter weather has set in. The ruble weakened on Wednesday, sliding past the 71 mark against the dollar, as sanctions on Russian oil and their probable impact on export revenues put pressure on the Russian currency. The ruble lost about 8% against the dollar last week and is on course for a hefty monthly decline after an oil embargo and price cap came into force. The finance ministry has said the recent slump is related to recovering imports. At 7:05 GMT, the ruble was 1.1% weaker against the dollar at 71.19, moving in the direction of the almost 8-month low of 72.6325 struck last week. Russia's Gazprom said that it will ship 42.3 million cubic meters of gas to Europe via Ukraine on Wednesday, a volume broadly in line with recent days.